It's Tuesday, it's 12:15 and we're live in Westminster. With me today, former Conservative Cabinet Minister Robert Jenrick, former Labour Minister Margaret Hodge, the co-leader of the Scottish Greens and Scottish Government Minister Lorna Slater, and the Daily Mail's John Stevens. Today, tough questions for party leaders ahead of local elections.
Are you honest, Prime Minister?
I think yes.
Let's talk a little bit about Beergate, shall we?
There was no party, there was no breach of the rules.
Will the elections be a verdict on Westminster? Record profits for BP. Is now the time for a windfall tax?
It would not be the right thing to do, in my opinion, to strip away profits which will be reinvested.
They weren't expecting these profits. They're completely unexpected. It's a windfall, and we should use some of that money to give a big tax cut for people who are struggling.
Migrants once again heading to Britain in small boats. Will the government's plan to send asylum seekers to Rwanda deter future crossings? And did lockdown fuel a culture of dependency in Britain? So, difficult questions for the party leaders, as you would expect, a couple of days away from elections across the UK. My opening question to the panel is, what will be at the forefront of voters' minds, do you think, Robert? Will it be Partygate and the culture at Westminster?
No, it will be the cost of living. That's the overwhelming issue facing people right across the country. I hope it will also be who is best placed to deliver you good local services and keep your council tax down, of which local Conservative councils locally have an extremely good record. And when I was local government secretary, I had to deal with Labour councils in Liverpool, where we sent commissioners in due to corruption, Croydon, where the council went bankrupt, Nottingham, where the council went bankrupt and created a ludicrous nationalised energy scheme called Robin Hood. I could go on. Conservative councils generally deliver the best public services whilst keeping taxes
Generally,
low.
but not always.
Not always. There's always a variety, but the rule is a pretty hard and fast one.
All right, well, we can test that perhaps later on. But, Margaret, what do you think these elections will be about? Will they be a verdict on lockdown-breaking parties or cost of living?
I think it'll be both, actually. I think cost of living, I agree with Robert, is going to be the main issue that concerns people. But let's pretend that Partygate's gone away, Robert. It is there. And, you know, on the doorstep every time you get a lot of people just raising it. And just on the issue, I wish people did vote more on local issues. I'm a great localist. But on the whole, you know, when you talk to people locally, it's what happens in their immediate area that they want to talk about. So they will talk about how the bins are collected or antisocial behaviour, those sort of issues. They will talk about that. But when it then comes to voting, they tend to go on national issues. So I'm afraid it's more a verdict on national than it is on local.
Lorna, where are you on this? Will it be a verdict on the culture at Westminster or local issues?
I think it will be local issues, and the cost of living is a local issue everywhere. But the things that concern people are, how are they going to pay their rent? How are they going to pay their bills? There's litter in their streets and in their parks. How are they going to, what can we do to improve their lives? And so many of these services that people depend on are delivered by local councils. The council elections are so important for exactly that, for delivering locally. We're very lucky here in Scotland. We have Greens in government, and we've been able to support policies at a government level which can really only be delivered by councils at a local level. So that's why it's so important to get Greens into councils all over Scotland.
John, do you agree with the rest of the panel that Partygate will be a secondary issue, or the culture at Westminster, to some of the other things that they have outlined? What do your readers think?
I think there's a bit of a divide. If you speak to people who over the weekend were out canvassing in seats, people will say even within their constituency they had very different reactions. So some people who may have backed Boris for the first time in 2019 say that they think that these Partygate revelations that are going on for 6 months now, it's all an attempt to kind of get Boris, it's a smear. But then they find other people in those same seats who say that they've been long-term Tory voters and they're actually disappointed in the Prime Minister. They think he hasn't told the truth about the party parties, and that's the problem for them. So I think it's different about different people in different places. But whatever happens, I think when it comes to Friday, we're not going to be talking about bins and council tax. I think we're going to have a proper dissection where people talk about, has Boris Johnson tainted the Tory brand, and is Keir Starmer doing enough to make cut through?
All right.
I'm not sure, if I can say so, Jo, that Friday will tell us that much. We've just got to remember that this is going to be a change from what happened in 2018.
Is this a bit of managing expectations?
Well, no, it's not. It's actually a bit of reality, a reality check on what will happen on Thursday and then Friday. So 2018 was a year that Labour did better than, you know, the disastrous last general election. So there's a bit of that around. So I don't think we're going to see many councils changing hands. We may see a larger number of Conservative council losing their seats. And can I just say something? I do think today, you know, talking about I'm going to do a speech to the Ukrainian Parliament. I just wish that we had Keir Starmer
Boris
doing
Johnson.
that, rather than Boris, you know, who's a consummate liar, who has shown no integrity,
All right.
who acts with impunity. I just wish we'd had Keir Starmer, who we can trust.
Margaret, with all due respect, Boris Johnson was invited by President Zelensky to address the Ukrainian Parliament. He's the first world leader to do so. We should all be proud of that as a country.
But it is helpful, isn't it, the timing of it too, in terms of electioneering?
Well, that's the timing that presumably the Prime Minister was offered by President Zelensky. But
I wonder.
I
wonder, Robert.
You, Margaret, fought valiantly against Jeremy Corbyn, and I admire you greatly for that. But had Labour won the last general election, it wouldn't be Keir Starmer who was fighting this fight. It would be Jeremy Corbyn.
All right, let's talk about these.
Imagine what our response would have been.
Well, let's talk about these local elections coming up. You say you want to, or you expect people to have the cost of living at the front of their minds. Well, the Prime Minister was confronted about that precise issue directly in his interview on ITV. Here's what he had to say when Good Morning Britain Susanna Reid told him about Elsie, a 77-year-old pensioner whose energy bills have gone up from £17 to more than £85. Let's take a listen.
The supermarket at the end of the day to buy yellow sticker discounted items. She gets up early in the morning to use her Freedom bus pass to stay on buses all day to avoid using energy at home. What else should Elsie cut back on, in your opinion?
I don't want Elsie to cut back on anything. Let's talk about Elsie and what we're doing. And just to remind you that the 24-hour Freedom bus pass was something that I actually introduced.
Robert, is that really an appropriate answer to talk about the Freedom bus pass, which Elsie, this particular pensioner, is using to keep warm during the day and try and laud the fact that it was brought in by Boris Johnson?
Well, I was one of the first people in Cabinet to start talking about the cost of living because I thought inflation was going to hit
so the answer is
astronomical
no.
levels, and it has done. I think many in politics have been slow to wake up to this. I think the Bank of England have performed extremely poorly in keeping inflation in check and have continued until now to do quantitative easing. I think we need to do more. I argued against the rise in national insurance because I think it's a very ill-timed moment to be increasing taxes on working people. We are, however, it has to be said, doing a number of things. The Chancellor implemented a £9 billion package, and I think the best answer to Elsie would have been to say that we've put £1 billion at the disposal of local councils on the grounds that they know best how to target money to the most vulnerable. And so if you are in that position and you're falling between the gaps in the schemes that have been created, the best thing to do is to pick up the phone to your local council. And they do have substantial amounts of money available to make a discretionary grant to help you through the coming months.
All right. We also talked, Margaret, there about Partygate and about, as you said, trust in the Prime Minister. But Keir Starmer, leader of the opposition's response when pressed about whether he himself broke the rules when drinking a beer on the campaign trail in Durham last year. Let's just take a listen to his response.
No party, no rules were broken. That is the long and the short of it.
You haven't answered my question, which is about contact from Durham Police. Have there been any contact with you or the office in recent weeks?
The police looked at this months ago and it came to a clear conclusion that was no rules were broken, and that's because no rules were broken.
Not quite
all
what
the
I
rest
asked. I just
of
wondered
it.
if they've been back in touch since the local MP's been raising questions about it.
Well, look, they've already concluded their investigation. No rules were broken.
Coming under pressure there on the Today programme from Martha Carney on the BBC. Should he just welcome Keir Starmer another investigation, if that's what it takes, or an investigation by Durham Police into what went on that campaign trail?
Well, to be honest, I do think this is a bit of cheap politics. I've got to say, you know, the Conservatives trying to raise an issue. There he was working in Durham, he was working late at night, he had a break for a pizza and a beer, and then he went back to work. And can I just say, the police have got better. The police did investigate at the time. They found no grounds for taking it further. And the idea that the police time should be spent on investigating yet again, I think is really a bit for the birds. And I just do think this is the sort of politics we don't want. This is so different from the constant parties at Downing Street. It's so different from deliberately refusing to play by the rules. It's so different.
I mean, do you agree it's just a cheap shot, not comparable to the sorts of things that Boris Johnson is accused of?
I think the reason that this is back in the headlines and that Labour haven't been able to bat away this story is because we haven't had straightforward answers to straightforward questions. And that has poured fuel on the flames of the story. There we saw that recording of Keir Starmer asked a simple question: have Durham Police been back in contact with you in the last few days since this has been back in the headlines? And he didn't give an answer. And I think that's why people think that he appeared slippery there and he didn't give a straightforward question. And we've had problems like Labour told the Daily Mail back in January that Angela Rayner wasn't present. Last week they confirmed she was present. Keir Starmer's always said that he went back to work after having that meal. We found out last week that that photo of him having the beer was actually after 10 o'clock at night. So I think that's the problem for Labour, is they haven't been able to give answer to straightforward questions.
Let me let Margaret respond, then I must get to Lorna.
Well, I think he has given answer on the substantive issues. I mean, he said today on the Today programme, I did go back to work after 10 o'clock. He said he worked. The Angela Rayner thing was an honest mistake. And I come back, you know, he's answered the actual allegations. There has been a police presumably oversight and investigation to was he or was he not telling the truth. And I can't quite see where he has avoided the truth. The only thing you could say is, should he have answered the question directly about the police? And, you know, maybe in the heat of the moment.
Oh, hang on. We've done this. I want to get to Lorna, because actually the First Minister, Nicola Sturgeon, also fell foul of COVID rules when she forgot to wear a face mask indoors, and it was reported to the police after footage showed her appearing to break Scotland's COVID laws. Are these things important, Lorna?
Of course, really important that politicians adhere to the rules that they make for everyone else. But I'm really distressed that so much bandwidth is taken up by looking at these issues, especially when the infractions are small, when I think the bigger issue is that oil and gas companies are making record profits, while at the same time we have people who are risking destitution to try and keep their homes warm. You know, people's pockets there's no more room, there's no more budget, there's no more cuts they can make. We absolutely need to be talking about how to get more money into people's pockets. And it strikes me that in this conversation how different the landscape looks in Scotland, where we have done things like double the Scottish child payment, where we have free school meals for all primary school children, where we have free bus travel. These are not just one-off payments to try and patch a hole. This is putting in place a well-being economy that benefits everyone. And I'm so glad we have that here.
Right, well, let's talk to you about that, because we are going to talk about the oil and gas windfall tax proposed by Labour and the Liberal Democrats following them. Let's just have a look at this headline. BBC News: BP profits soar as calls for windfall tax grow. Since you mentioned it, Lorna, let's start with you. Can you categorically say that you back a windfall tax specifically on oil and gas companies?
The Scottish Greens absolutely back a windfall tax on oil and gas companies.
Right, but
they have made record profits.
What's the problem then with your partners, where you're cooperating with the SNP, who haven't been as explicit? They say they would like a windfall tax on all companies who have made profits, obscene profits, to use your colleague's term. Are you disappointed by them?
They've called for windfall tax on all businesses. That seems sensible to me. I think there are other businesses who also made a windfall during the COVID pandemic. We need to make sure that money is reinvested back into the public purse so that we have the kind of excellent public services, well-funded NHS that we all need.
All right, and
it isn't right for these profits to be going offshore and disappearing out of the country.
Well, except, of course, they would argue that they're going back into investment into green technologies. Is now, Robert, is the time right, I should say, for a windfall tax, as proposed by Labour, on oil and gas companies, when you look at the record profits?
No, it isn't. I've argued consistently against it. Firstly, the oil and gas sector in this country employs 100,000 people. So I think it's extraordinary to hear Scottish Greens campaigning against these companies that employ so many people in the northeast of Scotland. But the most important point is that if we want to have energy security, if we want to have a transition to net zero, then you need these companies to thrive, and you need them to have a climate in which they can invest with confidence in the UK.
But they've made £5 billion of profits.
6 billion.
Exactly.
Well, 6 billion, sorry, 5.9 billion.
Well, let's look at that, shall we? Firstly, BP has written off $20 billion worth of assets in Russia because the British government asked them to do so, and they quite rightly agreed quickly to do so, selling down their stake in Rosneft and exiting the Russian market. Secondly, they've agreed to invest £18 billion between now and 2030 in opening up more assets in the North Sea and in the transition to net zero. What history shows you is that if you want businesses to invest, you need to give them fiscal certainty. That's what we're doing. Of course, I want those businesses to get on and make those investments, not just do share buybacks.
Well, Margaret, you don't want to see these.
You
don't want to see these companies withdrawing investment or not spending the money on the sorts of green transition that you want to see.
No, but these are unexpected excess profits that they have made. This isn't sort of... we would talk about fiscal certainty in an era where there was actually profits, a bit of profits. These are unexpected one-off profits that they have made because of the change.
In the oil and gas sector, you can say that about most profits. This is a cyclical industry. There's big highs, big lows. If you tax them when they're having profitable years...
All right, well, let Margaret finish her point. Let Margaret finish her point.
And so I don't... It may be cyclical, and it may be that, you know, when that happens, we should think again, as we ought to now. You and I have just agreed that cost of living is the key thing, the key issue that is confronting all our constituents at the moment. And I don't actually agree with Lorna that this goes into general expenditure. I think this is the point at which you could take that money and you could make a real difference to people's energy bills now. And all those new energy bills are now coming through the door, and they're more than double the amount that people paid prior to the raising of the energy cap. So there's a real thing you could do. And the other thing, just to say to you, of course we want investment in green, in energy generally, to release us from dependency on Russia, and in the new green technologies. But they're doing it anyway. You said that they did that before the excess profits. And there are other players in the field who are not necessarily the big oil companies who are also investing there and providing the green energy
John,
of the future.
Is there a split politically in government now on this? Because the government has rejected this idea, but actually Rishi Sunak, the Chancellor, hinted in an interview or answering questions on Mumsnet that actually he would look at it again if he felt that oil and gas companies were not keeping to their commitment of investment. But Kwasi Kwarteng, the Business Secretary, still said no.
Yeah, I think the problem with this for the government is they are coming under pressure because Labour are using this as a tactic quite effectively. In the past, you've had Labour firing out policies scattergun, and on this, they focused on two things. Since before the budget last year, they were saying we needed a VAT cut on energy bills. That is something easy to explain to people and simple. And for the last few months, they've been saying we need a windfall tax on oil and gas firms. And that's very simple to explain to someone on a doorstep. Compare that to the ideas that Rishi Sunak's come forward, this idea of this kind of rebate on your energy bill, and then you pay a bit back then, and but it's more of a loan, and that's something to do with your council tax you might get. No one has a clue what that is going to do, but Labour have been able to hammer these ideas again and again and again, and they're helped by things like oil firms having to do quarterly results when their bosses come forward and say, hey, we've made all these billions of pounds of profits, and Labour able to say, here are the fat cats that we should be hitting.
Do you know what I sort of vaguely feel? That this is an ideological approach by the government rather than a pragmatic approach.
No, I think it's the opposite, Margaret.
No, well, we're sitting here with a cost of living, an absolute now cost of living crisis, and you need a pragmatic response to that with a very simple...
Well, let Robert answer.
Well, I think what you're really saying is you take a short-termist view, which is let's squeeze the profits of these businesses now because it's politically salient, rather than let's encourage British businesses to invest in our energy security and our transition to net zero, for which people will reap the benefits for years to come. If we've learned anything this
more
year,
oil fields in the North Sea is not a long-term plan.
I want to see more oil
that
fields
is
in
not
the
in
North
keeping
Sea.
with our obligations to the climate emergency. You simply cannot open more oil fields
well, you
and
keep
tackle the
importing
climate
more
crisis.
oil and gas from Vladimir Putin and Saudi Arabia, Venezuela, doing deals with
The quickest way to energy security is to
to
reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, and that means reducing homes that are dependent on gas for heating, insulating homes, moving homes over to heat pumps. That is the #1 and quickest thing that you can do to reduce our dependency on those
say it's
foreign
the
gas.
quickest. What would you do about the jobs in those oil and gas industries in Scotland, Lorna?
I mean, this is why we're calling for a just transition.
Right.
Nobody anywhere is talking about turning off the tap right away, but you cannot expand oil and gas. You cannot open new fields up at the same time as tackling the climate crisis.
Okay, well,
oil and gas needs to transition away from oil and gas to sustainable energy. We know that. We all know that.
All right, I still haven't heard exactly how you would perform that just transition in terms of people losing their jobs in those industries.
Well, I can answer that question if you'd like.
Yeah, you can. You can answer it in conjunction with this, because your party's co-leader Patrick Harvey, in an interview with BBC Good Morning Scotland, said only the hard right seem to support more new gas and oil exploration. I presume you agree with him, and you're talking about Robert Jenrick.
Absolutely. The climate emergency hasn't gone away. This is an existential threat to humanity. We're talking about, in the next 10 years, already exceeding the 1.5 degrees that we need to keep the Earth at the inhabitable level that we currently are. That means no new oil fields. Now, we're very lucky in Scotland. We have 25% of all the Europe's offshore renewable energy potential. We can tap into that. And there's big projects here like the ScotWind project, which companies like BP and so on are investing in, which we can transition energy. This will be
just to be clear, you
jobs.
and Patrick are saying that people who support continued oil and gas exploration are on the hard right.
I can see the frustration that people have, where there is an alignment between right-wing politics and wanting to open new oil and gas. That isn't the right approach. It's not a long-term sustainable approach. It is much better to look at the future of humanity and building sustainable businesses. We want our kids and grandkids and our communities to have a sustainable economy for decades to come.
But that's you, Robert Jenrick.
This is a hopelessly naive and irresponsible position. We want the UK to have energy security. We do not want to be at the behest of authoritarian regimes like Russia. We don't want to have to go and sign deals with Iran purely to access their oil. We want the UK to have energy security. Any way of looking at the transition to net zero involves continued use of fossil fuels for the foreseeable future. And so let's use the ones we have. So we have energy security, so we get the jobs, we get the tax revenues that, goodness me, we need right now to be funding our public services. And let's get the British businesses that are good at this, like BP, to be doing that whilst at the same time investing in green, renewable technologies that are the long-term answer.
All right, we're going to talk about small boat crossings, because over the bank holiday weekend, small boats did start arriving on the UK shores. We can see some pictures here. That followed a period of about 10 or 11 days where actually there were no boats at all coming across the channel. We can show you in just a moment a graph here, and you'll be able to see quite clearly the gap between about the 19th of April to the 30th of April, and this all following an announcement by the government, by Priti Patel, the Home Secretary, with her plan to immediately send those arriving to UK shores by those boat crossings to Rwanda, where they would have their asylum applications processed there. It hasn't actually started. Would you say it hasn't yet acted as a deterrent, Robert?
Well, I think it's too early to say. We've clearly had several days in which there were no individuals crossing the Channel. It's hard to know whether that's to do with the deterrent effect of the policy or the weather in the English Channel. There's now been a couple of days in which we've had migrants crossing again. If this policy is going to work, it has to be a deterrent. And so we are going to have to ensure that those illegal migrants, when they arrive in the UK, are taken in some numbers to Rwanda for their processing. I think it could work. It's practically a difficult policy to execute, but I hope it succeeds. And I haven't, frankly, heard any alternatives from the opposition or from critics in the media who either are just hand-wringing and leaving thousands of people exposed to criminal gangs, some of whom are dying needlessly in the Channel, or secretly want unlimited immigration. And for a whole range of reasons, economic, social, that is not a good thing for this country. All countries need to have controlled migration alongside safe resettlement programmes like the Homes for Ukraine scheme.
It's too early to say whether it will work, but do you agree that Labour hasn't got an alternative to that particular plan about disrupting the people smugglers?
Well, I promise you I'll answer that, Jo,
Right,
but I've got to... This is the most inhumane, expensive, extravagant policy, ridiculous policy that I've ever seen. It's one of the worst policies that we've seen emerge from the government. And I'd love to be, Robert, with you in 2 years' time when we're sitting here saying, well, why have so few people gone to Rwanda, if any at all? And there is that poll this morning, Jo, just to say that, where it was a swift poll taken of people coming across the Channel, where 3 out of 4 said that they'd come whether or not there was the threat. And the other thing to say is there's been a really worrying increase in people who have left the hotels, that people who've come over, who've left the hotels where they are staying whilst their application is being considered because they're scared they're going to go to Rwanda. We are actually criminalising people at the most vulnerable. Okay. Is there an alternative?
Yes. What's your alternative?
Well, my alternative is you first of all what you have to a safe legal route for asylum seekers. That just doesn't exist at the moment. There's no way you can come in. You can only apply for asylum.
How would that work? What would it look like, this safe legal route for asylum seekers? Because if you're in a country where you can't get to an embassy, let's say, or you're not in a refugee camp being able to make an application for asylum, what does a safe legal route look like if you can't get on a plane to come here and then make a pitch?
So well, I'm not going to do the details today, but we used to have it. We had it before. We had people coming into the country and seeking asylum. And let me just say this. Let me say the 3 things that I think. You need a safe legal system. You need an asylum where the applications are considered in a timely manner, efficiently. At the moment, we don't have that. And the third thing I say is, and going back on the people smugglers, where I think we share there that we want to go tough on them. I think you've just got to work much better than we are doing with our European and French colleagues to bear down on them. And then the final thing, one of my obsessions, this is dirty money behind a lot of this. This is, a lot of illegal money, and we need to have all the things that I've always been talking about to expose and fight dirty money. And so I think there is an alternative policy that you could pursue that isn't inhumane, that doesn't criminalise people at their most vulnerable, and that actually deals with the people smugglers that we all want to bear down on.
I share some of what Margaret said, but I don't think in essence it's going to work. What Margaret's saying is that if you were an economic migrant and you had some route into the UK other than crossing in these boats, then you might make an application, apply, and not take the chance with your life to cross the Channel. In reality, these individuals are going to make that dangerous journey unless what Margaret really says is that she wants unlimited immigration.
I don't want to. That's Robert. That is no, Robert. You're misinterpreting. I don't want. I want a strong, controlled immigration system that does actually
to deter people from making these journeys.
No, you have to have a safe route in, but you then have to deal efficiently and effectively with the applications. Maybe because I've been in politics so long, we used to have asylum seekers came in. They were then handled never as efficiently as one would like, but certainly more efficiently than today. And actually what happened when that worked was there were fewer and fewer people who came in seeking asylum. They did come in then through work permits, so they did come in through student visas. They found other routes in. People will always find routes in. And if you look at this current group of people who've come over from on the boats, a lot of them are Somali refugees. They are, they are people. They are really people seeking refuge from war and strife.
All right. Well, let me ask Lorna. I mean, Lorna, should everyone who arrives via those small boats over the Channel, should they be given asylum in the UK?
They need to be allowed to apply for asylum. They, in fact, have the human right to do so. So the categorization of asylum seekers, refugees as illegal immigrants is wrong.
Are you saying that everyone that comes across in those
dehumanising.
boats are asylum seekers and not economic migrants?
Well, and let's separate that out too, because that seems to be getting mixed up. People have the right to apply for asylum, and so they need to be allowed to enter that process. That's their human right. If you know, I also think that people should have routes to, if they want to come and build a new life in another country. Yes, let's make sure there are. I agree with Margaret. Safe routes for them to do that. If we make it too difficult, if we make it so that there are no options for people, we put them in these desperate situations. In Scotland, we have labour shortages in really key industry. We would very much like to be able to have more immigration in Scotland. We welcome refugees here. And it's very frustrating that Westminster kind of locks down immigration policies and doesn't look at what Scotland actually needs.
All right, well, let me just show you this tweet from Nick Timothy today, former advisor to former Prime Minister Theresa May. He says, if the government doesn't send all or almost all these migrants to Rwanda, the policy will fail. This is now a test of competence and resolve in face of criminal pressure and legal challenge. Is that going to be the bar for success?
Well, as my view, I said it earlier in the programme, was that this is a technically difficult policy to execute in the long term. So it has to work as a deterrent. If you're going to make it work as a deterrent, as Nick says, you need to send a very large number of the migrants crossing the channel to Rwanda. If it's just, you know, 1 or 2 plane loads, as I suspect is what Rwanda are thinking, then I don't think it's going to have the impact the government want it to. So it's going to have to be done at some scale to ensure that there's the deterrent effect. I would just say that, to pick up on a point that's just been made, you know, these are not people in a desperate situation. They are in France.
Well,
they're in a safe country.
Well, you don't know on either.
Well, I think France is a safe country.
I mean, just one final thing.
Well,
Robert has admitted, actually, in his response, that this policy will not work. There will be hardly any. We'll have spent billions of pounds,
and it won't. I hope it does work, Margaret.
No, you hope it does, but it won't. And I think this is going to be a scandal of the size of the Windrush scandal.
Well, let Robert respond, and then I just want to ask John something.
In later years.
Well, look, I think it is a technically difficult policy to make work.
It won't work.
It will only work if it provides a clear deterrent. That involves getting on with it now and getting a large number of the illegal migrants on planes to Rwanda. I would just say we haven't heard any real alternatives from anybody.
I have given you an alternative.
You haven't. Your alternative.
I've given you a very coherent alternative.
Was that we create a route whereby anyone in the world who wishes to come here could apply to the UK.
I'm going to ask John.
That's not going to work. There are millions of people who want to come to the UK.
I will ask John this question. It is politically fraught, this issue, just listening to this discussion. Whether it works or not, we don't know.
No, and I think there is a real risk that it gets tangled up in legal problems. We see on the front page of The Guardian today about this mass legal action being taken against Priti Patel. But I think on the political side, if there are legal problems and it doesn't happen, then I think you'll see the government arguing that we tried to take action on this, but we were stopped from doing so by Labour and the legal establishment.
All right. But they could take action by having a more efficient, safe and legal way, and by tackling the people smugglers. That's where they could take action.
Let me just show you this headline in The Guardian. Priti Patel faces mass legal action from Ukrainians stuck in visa backlog. This is the scheme that has been set up by the government for Ukrainian refugees. It does require a visa application. I just wanted to ask you, Robert, because you have direct experience of this, because you are now housing a family from Ukraine. You've also outlined why you are disappointed with the obstacles that have been placed in the way. This just underlines it's not going away.
Well, it has been a bumpy start to the programme. My own experience was not ideal. It took us 3 or 4 weeks to get the visas through, and they came in a sort of random order of, you know, a child one day, several days later, the mum, and that's not an unusual experience. I think the Home Office are improving the system. 27,000 Ukrainians have now arrived in the UK under this scheme. That's a lot of people in a short period of time. So I wouldn't overstate those issues. There's clearly more work for the Home Office to do to make sure the system works better. Okay. But my own experience is this has been a hugely rewarding and enriching one for my family. We have a lovely Ukrainian family staying with us. I think that's going to be mirrored by tens of thousands of sponsor families across the country. So I do think this is something that we'll look back on with pride in years to come, even if, to begin with, it's been a bit bumpy.
Well, I was going to say brilliant on you, Robert, for opening your home to a Ukrainian family. I really think that's great. But equally, I've got somebody in my family who's trying to house a Ukrainian family, a granny, a mum and a baby. And they're stuck at the moment. The granny and the mum have now got their visa. The baby hasn't, can you believe it? So they're stuck in war-ridden Ukraine. And really what everybody is saying, I mean, if you look at Germany's taken 80,000. The Poles have got, what, 2, 3, I can't even remember how many million they've got, but millions of people. And all everybody is saying is drop those drop the visa scheme, bring people here. It's over 90%. I think even Boris said that in telly this morning. Over 90% women and children. They're hardly a danger. And then do all the checks that you need to do when the people are here. That's the humane way of going forward.
All right.
Not just sort of making us a hostile environment. And just one final thing, Jo, is if you're a mum, you know, if like this family that we're trying to get in at the moment to help. If you're, you know, a granny, a mum and a baby, you're dealing with all the trauma of the world, of the war, and then you've got to come and deal with all the trauma of the visa scheme, however efficient you make it.
But do you agree with some checks being done for the families, checking up on Robert Jenrick, that being suitable to
I do think we need to do those quick checks. Those have been done more efficiently. I think the local authorities are doing those efficiently. And I think the rest of the checks on the individuals you can do when they're here.
Let me just show you this headline in the Daily Telegraph. It was written by Lord David Frost, the former Brexit minister. Britain is being overwhelmed by a rising tide of statism, entitlement and dependency, where he says people look to the state to solve their problems rather than making efforts themselves. Do you agree with him, Robert?
Well, I think what I have seen is that as a result of the pandemic, government has spent a huge amount of money. We've spent £450 billion tackling that extraordinary situation. That's £10,000 for every adult in the country. And that has made a lot of people reach to the state to protect them from any situation or crisis that might emerge. And it means within politics, people say, well, that's, you know, peanuts, or, you know, when I was a government minister, you could secure billions of pounds for an important issue. And people say, well, that's a drop in the ocean. You've spent £400 billion on the pandemic. Surely you could spend more on this particular issue. I do think we've got to face reality now. We are a heavily indebted country. We have sclerotic economic growth, and taxes have reached the highest level in my lifetime. Something's got to give. We're going to have to move as carefully as we can to a state where we are watching value for money for the taxpayer. We're trying to keep people's taxes low, cutting taxes wherever we can, and accept that the state can't step in and shield everyone from every issue. It should focus, of course, on shielding the most vulnerable people in society in the most targeted way it can do. But whether it's inflation as a result of the war in Ukraine or another pandemic, the state simply can't step in the same way every time. Or else we're going to go back to a 1970s Britain of high spending, very high taxes, low growth, and I certainly don't want to see that country.
Lorna?
Of course, I completely disagree, and this is the fundamental divide, I think, in politics, whereas I see putting together public services that are properly funded as a work in empowering people, that collaborative working together to make sure our communities work. And a good example of that in Scotland is our free bus travel for everyone 21 and under. That means families can take their kids to see their grandmother. It means they can spend their money. That means they can visit each other's work, study. These kind of policies empower people to live the kind of lives they want, and they put in place a well-being economy which prioritizes people's lives being better. That's what the economy should do. Instead, what's happened in Westminster is that people are wedged between high rents, low wages, low opportunities, and the coronavirus crisis, which has wiped out people's savings. It's a desperate time for people. And you can't just take your hands off and say, oh, well, it's your own fault. You need to sort yourself out. We need to work together to create a more caring society where we look out for each other.
Robert?
Well, I certainly think you need to protect the most vulnerable in society, but we've got to be more honest and say that everything has to be paid for. We already are very heavily in debt. Taxes are extremely high. We've got to create a dynamic economy in which businesses want to invest, create growth to pay for those public services. And the other point that David Frost made in that article was that there is this broader culture now of ESG where people are taking slightly naive calls on the big issues, like saying that
ESG being environmental and social factors.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You know, saying, for example, that you must not invest in fossil fuels. Well, we've discovered this year that by not investing, we're at the behest of Vladimir Putin in Russia.
I absolutely don't agree. That's because of not investing in insulating homes and changing your energy when you had the chance. It's because David Cameron scrapped the green crap. It's not because of a lack of investment in oil and gas. It's because of a lack of investment in the alternatives.
Or saying that we shouldn't be, pension funds mustn't invest in arms companies, for example. Well, thank goodness we have great British businesses at the moment manufacturing weapons that we're able to give to the brave Ukrainian armed forces. So I think we do. The world is a darker place than we would like to imagine. I think we have to be alive to that.
Yes, OK.
And ensure that we're having those honest conversations.
Well, it's about, OK, an honest conversation. It is about the response. Some people would argue the government hasn't necessarily been honest on the sorts of changes and investment and sacrifices people will have to make in order to reach the sort of climate change targets. But on another issue, the government stepped in and did whatever it took, so Rishi Sunak said, in terms of the pandemic. It is quite difficult for people now, isn't it, to be told that it's time for the state to withdraw a little bit. Half £500 billion or whatever it was spent during the pandemic. It was unexpected. Is it right now, as Lord Frost would argue, to try, in his words, to wean people off some of that state support?
No, I think we're getting back to an old ideological divide, and that's quite interesting, Jo. So I believe the state is a force for good. And I'd put three arguments on the table around that. The first is that we all need the sort of infrastructure that enables us to thrive and prosper, live in security, whether it's investment in defence or it's investment in roads or whether it's investment in health service, all those things. That's the infrastructure.
And is that the government's levelling up strategy? Is that what that's trying to do?
Then I was going to do a second thing. I think the state is a force for good in tackling inequality. And I think that's really important if you also want a society that is at peace with itself. And that means doing things like investing in Sure Start, which this government has destroyed, or it's investing in benefits. And then I think a third thing for the state actually can be a force for good for encouraging private enterprise. So if you have investment in research and innovation, or if you have investment in skills trading, take that as another example. Those are two ways where the state, by its investment, creates an environment in which the private sector can flourish. And I think this argument, it's really interesting, David Frost's argument, because it gets us back to the old ideological divide.
Do you agree? Is it the old ideological divide, John, or is he just putting forward some sort of leadership bid, do you think, if Boris Johnson were ever to step down?
Well, I'm not sure about that, but I think most voters aren't stupid. I think they know that the government isn't going to be able to negate all the impacts of the cost of living crisis, but it doesn't mean they don't have opinions on whether the government's doing a not or not. I think part of the problem on energy bills and why it's become an issue for the government having to do something about rising energy bills is because the energy price cap has meant that the government is now involved in setting the prices of electricity and gas, whereas before it would have been the big bad energy companies putting up bills. Now it's the government has a role in that, and I think that's why there's been so much pressure on Rishi Sunak over this issue.
Right, I mean, Lord Frost does say, Robert Jenrick, that the dependency culture stems from three things, which include the crash, climate change campaigns and the pandemic. So it was created by Conservative governments, successive Conservative governments, the culture that he's criticising since 2010.
Well, I don't think the financial crash was a result of Conservative governments.
But it was their reaction to it.
Global,
no, but it was it's the reaction to these three things.
Policies. No, look, I think I can't speak for Lord Frost, but what I think the argument he's making is that a series of significant global issues have changed people's attitudes. The financial crash reduced people's confidence in business, in banking and in the private sector. Climate change requires collective action in order to overcome one, if not the biggest generational issues that we face. And then COVID has required a big state to wrap its arms around as many people as possible. The future of the country, however, has got to be one in which we have a dynamic economy where we encourage people to become entrepreneurs, to invest. And to do that, we need to move to a different mindset.
But do you agree with...
Briefly,
do you agree with me?
You've got seconds.
Two things. Do you agree with me that actually that requires the good state to invest to facilitate that? And we're miles from where we were with Margaret Thatcher.
All right, you're going to have to answer after the programme. That's all we've got time for. Thank you to all of my guests from all of us here. Bye-bye.